And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, at opednews.com/podcasts, on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud, and more. I'm really excited to have back two guests who have been on this show before. They've got an amazing new book out, a book that I think every person on this planet who can read should read. It's a really important book because it gives credit for where we come from, and it explores the wisdom that humans developed over millions of years, that a lot of it we lost since the onset of civilization. My guests for the show are Darcia Narvaez and Four Arrows, also known as Don Trent Jacobs. They are the co-authors, among several others, of an incredible new book, Indigenous Sustainable Wisdom, First Nation Know-How for Global Flourishing. Darcia Narvaez is professor of psychology at Notre Dame University, and she's the author of a book that I covered with her before, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality, Evolution, Culture, and Wisdom, and many, many other books. Most of them, I think, exploring child rearing. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes,
Okay.
evolution.
And evolution, yeah.
Neurobiology.
And Darcia also has a blog on Psychology Today. Four Arrows, a.k.a. Don Trent Jacobs, Ph.D., EDD, is the author of Unlearning the Language of Conquest and Teaching Truly, a Curriculum to Indigenize Mainstream Education. So I want to congratulate you guys. This book is just incredible. Can you show it on the screen, John? You got a picture of it? Both there, double. Yeah, great.
That's stereo book covers, huh?
Yes. And now this book, going by the cover, came out of the conference that I attended a couple years ago at Notre Dame, that was looking at Indigenous wisdom. And right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so let's start off by telling us why you did this book. What's the main message and goal of this book?
Well, I'll start for us. The reason is, there's multiple reasons always, but we were interested in awakening many people in the modern world, modern societies, to the fact that there are ways to live sustainably, and many societies did so and have done so and still do so. And so it's a matter of restoring our sense of earth connectedness, our nature connection, and being aware of our integration into the web of life. And then we learn to, especially if you raise children with all sorts of supports, we learn to be members of the bio community in ways that are sustainable. And right now we're really off the rail in so many ways, and we push parents and kids in the wrong direction, and the whole society's kind of going downhill. So that's why, come on, let's wake up, come back to restore our human potential.
And Four Arrows, you want to add to that?
Well, Darcia's really the backbone of and the initiative for this project. She asked me if I would participate in it and if I could bring some of the top Indigenous scholars and Indigenous voices that are not scholars, like White Standing Buffalo, to the conference. And so I really honor what Darcia has done. I think that for both of us, this book is really was foreseeing what just came out in the May 15th United Nations report on extinction rates, which is the largest study from 50 countries, 450 of the top environmental scientists, going over 15,000 scholarly peer-reviewed documents on climate change and extinction rates. And I just had an article come out in The Nation that is seeing something that Darcia and I and our colleagues saw, that nobody has really pinned down like this before. They say, in essence, that worldview, not technology and science alone, is the only way we're going to pull out of this. And then they are, they don't say it as boldly and directly as we do in our book, but they say, after they refer to worldview, that in places where indigenous cultures are in control of their land, that this rate of extinction, which is 1 million more in the next generation of species, that it's not happening, or it's happening in much smaller ways. And so I think, this is a really an important thing that more and more people have to notice. And we sort of jumped the gun on it by saying, well, here's why.
Yes. I like to mention, I've got a new book out, The Bottom Up Revolution. And one of the main messages that I try to put out in that book is that we need to develop connection consciousness, how we're connected to each other and how we're connected to nature. And that is really an essential part. I think that, I really, as I read your book, your new book, I kept thinking, yeah, this is what I'm saying too. Yeah. There are so many places in so many ways that it's so. And I would say almost every single interview that I do with whoever, I talk about indigenous wisdom and the need for it and how it's lacking and how we have to grab it. And this is like an encyclopedia of it. It's an incredible, valuable treasure of knowledge and wisdom and thinking that, it looks like you've written it so it'll also be a textbook too, with questions after each chapter.
That's right. We hope that college courses will use it.
Well, my experience is that that's a step. What we really need to have is, and I know that some places they exist, there need to be indigenous wisdom departments, whole departments, or at least sections within history departments. I had one not long ago, Michael Yellowbird, who has kind of a department like that. And that's what we need. We need to get rid of this. I mean, what I've learned is that bottom-up history has replaced top-down history. The old history that was all that there was, where people were taught about generals and kings and rulers and monarchs and billionaires, has been replaced almost entirely, so that top-down historians are an endangered species. Good thing. And I think that what we have with your book is the beginning and hopefully a first step to teaching the indigenous wisdom in indigenous ways, in indigenous worldviews. And I think that worldview aspect is so important.
I think it's key, Rob. It's the water in which we swim. The story of the two fish that are swimming by, and an elder fish says, "Hey, how's the water, guys?" And then they look at each other and go, "Hey, what's water?" That's the problem that we have. And I think our book, really, the authors that contributed to this book are really addressing worldview as well as local knowledge, place-based knowledge. But I would like to go further than what you're suggesting with departments in education. I really believe that the movement that we're seeing in Canada right now is the decolonizing and indigenizing movement, which, as Joe Kenchlow, the late, great Joe Kenchlow said, is full of slippery slopes and complexities and risks, but the profound benefits are worth it. And that is that this should be across the curriculum, that everything from truth and reconciliation to support for sovereignty of indigenous peoples, but much more than that. This isn't about saving indigenous peoples. This is about saving everything on the planet. And every single course is got a colonized hegemonic perspective. And without worldview reflection in each course, then that what you're talking about isn't going to happen. And that's one of the fights I have with my university, who are very supportive of developing a department or a course. And but I'm saying, this is too big. Climate change is too big. Survival is too big. And the indigenous worldview, we now know for certain, is the solution to our survival. So this has got to be in math, social science, every course possible.
The challenge is that I find in teaching my psychology classes, this view is that they think it's a pseudoscience to think because indigenous perspective is holistic. It takes everything into account. You don't just train your intellect, you train your heart, your intuitions, your relationships. Honor your relationships in the web of life and all your responsibilities in each moment. You pay attention to those things, right? But that's just so alien to the way we've been training children, the way we've been raising people, and what we focus their attention on every day. And so it takes one class with my students. I think some of them wake up and go, oh my God, we're really on the wrong track here. We have been, and but others can't take it in. They can't. I mean, they can, nod and such and go a couple inches, but it's going to take some time. We need a lot of help here. We need a lot of support systems to be built in, and we need channels on the television that present indigenous wisdom. We need immersed experiences in nature for kids everywhere. So there's a lot of work to be done, and everybody in every field can help with this work.
One of my favorite stories about indigenous wisdom is a Star Trek movie where there's an alien spacecraft that is dangerous, and it communicated with whales. And whales in that movie had gone extinct. So they had to go back in time to find whales so that they could get the connection happening between the alien spacecraft that had visited Earth so long ago. And in a way, I think that says a lot about indigenous wisdom. We're losing it. Thank goodness there are a couple 100 million indigenous people still on the planet, alive, surviving somewhat in their cultures. But we've really got to do everything we can to, I hate to use the word mine because it's such an extractive word, but we've got to get their wisdom, and your book is a wonderful beginning to that. So a concept that you've talked about a number of times already is worldview. So can we start by talking about what that means and how the modern Western worldview differs from the indigenous worldview?
You want to start?
Well, I mean, this is sort of what both of us sort of specialize in. There are, I can show you on a. Do you want to do a share screen, and I'll just show you a real brief.
That'll work for the video, but it won't work for the radio show.
Oh, okay. Well, just to give you an example, I'm giving a presentation on Thursday in Portland for the Alternative Education Resource Organization. So I'm going to be, talking to alternative schools from all over the world who really do some of these worldview ideas that are indigenous. But really, my goal is to show them that they got a long way to go, to really move alternative education into this field. But just for example, on one of my slides, I wrote down 40 precepts of worldview from what I call the dominant worldview manifestations compared to the indigenous worldview. And I mean, there's 40 of them. So, anthropocentric, versus animals, insects, plants, and water being our teachers. Truth is being determined in absolute as opposed to being multifaceted. Rigid boundaries versus flexible boundaries. Disbelief in spiritual energies, recognition of spiritual energy. I mean, there's 40 of them, right? So I could go on and on.
Can you share that so that when people are listening to this, they can go to opednews.com/podcasts and find this interview and see that list?
Sure, I'm happy to share it with you.
That'd be awesome. Good.
You're going to share it now on the screen?
No, let's keep going.
Okay. I'll send it to you then for your blog.
But so you've just given a list of a couple of examples. Is there like a big picture? And I know you've already been talking about it as we've had this conversation, but can you kind of summarize the difference between the Western and the indigenous ones?
Well, Four Arrows it got me on to Robert Redfield's work, where he contrasts so-called primitive worldview and the modern. And so he has kind of summarized it succinctly. In the original Indigenous view, First Nation view, the world is unified, the cosmos is unified, sacred, and moral. Whereas now we think that the cosmos is fragmented, we're disenchanted, there's no enchantment, there's nothing sacred, and it's amoral. So that's really basic. And I think my work points to how the way we treat babies sets up one worldview or the other, because the baby takes in their experience. And if they have a fragmented experience with relationships, they're going to go in this other direction, because that's the way their neurobiology is going to grow. It's going to be undermined to have this holistic kind of way of being with others. And I could say a lot about that. But so we have, instead of the dominant culture, a view that only humans are special, they have spirit, and we're at the pinnacle of evolution or whatever, of creation. We're the only ones that really matter, so don't worry about those others. They're lifeless anyway, they have no, so that weird kind of very opposite to the view that spirit pervades all things, everything is sentient, we're related, and we're actually the younger siblings of everyone else from whom we need to learn, and it goes on.
I'll give you
a great book, a novel that described that is Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. I really loved that, and I was really honored to be able to interview him. And he talked about how there have been a lot of civilizations on this planet. We have Western civilization here, but what he observed was that a lot of those civilizations ended themselves. They stopped, and ours doesn't seem to have a way to do that. And what makes me kind of my head explode is this idea that these technological billionaires are now proposing that Earth is going to be kaput, it's going to implode, so we're going to go to Mars and we're going to build a new planet and we'll live there and we'll live in outer space. What an insane, crazy concept. Yeah, we're going to be billionaires, we're going to make all this money, and we're going to destroy the Earth, but we'll come up with a solution that'll save the billionaires.
They've lost their hearts.
There is a
go ahead.
There is a belief system of both the Hopi and the Maya that say that this, in essence, it's that we have 7 worlds that have been given to our species to have this gift of life, and that we are in the 5th world, meaning that 4 times before the ability of humans to create technology and to forget the spiritual essence of how to use technology has resulted in catastrophe. Fire has been one, the Great Flood has been one, etc. So their essential belief is that we are on the verge of once again coming to a place where our technology and our science and our arrogance about our power relative to those things, absent of the spiritual understanding of relationships that Darcia just explained, is to our demise. Somebody asked me at a presentation at UBC last month on this topic, do you have hope? And for the first time ever, and a little bit reluctant, I said, well, let me tell you what my hope is. My hope is no longer that we're going to be able to turn it around, although deep down I know it's possible. My hope is that in the rebuilding, the people will not rebuild as you see in these dystopia movies, where what happens is a rebuilding with the hierarchies and the kinds of things.
You're talking about post-apocalyptically.
Exactly. That my hope is that as we show that we're going to be failing and we're going to have to rebuild, that we rebuild with this book that Darcia and I and Gene and George have edited, right? Because I don't want them to be picking up, one of the books written by Dick Cheney or somebody like that.
Yeah. So, and Darcia, you were going to comment about their hearts?
Yes. So What's really important in most societies for most of history, except now and recently, especially in European societies, what's been important is development of the heart mind. And that means an integration of emotion and understanding and embodied awareness and capacities. And we in the Western world have decided that's not really, important. I've just been reading Voltaire's Bastards, the rise of the dictatorship of reason in the West, by John Ralston Saul. And so he goes through all the sociological levels of how we got to this point where we think reason is to be detached, and to be detached emotionally and relationally is the best way to be. And you make all these bad decisions as a technocrat or as a radical
well, it makes me
hero.
think of a couple of things. We've got to do a station ID real quick. And so basically I'm gonna edit this out for the radio show and plug in a bumper, but here for the video, here's my book, The Bottom Up Revolution, and it just came out May 22nd, and it gives us, I think, a similar message. Both of you endorsed it very kindly and nicely. And I think that what I'm doing in my book is saying that, and it's really inspired by your work, Darcia. Is that humans evolved to be bottom-up beings. They evolved to have the kind of connection with nature and that mindset that you both described, the indigenous mindset. Civilization has repressed that mindset. And I think that technology in some ways is helping to bring it back. The internet and smartphones have catalyzed some of those repressed genes. And I think that's going to help us in some ways. Can be a problem too, but I think it can help us. And what we need is books like yours that give us the way to enable and activate those genes that you describe in your book, Neurobiology of Human Morality, in such detail. And we've got the potential to be the beings that humans were, and I think that those beings were better beings. Let me just, actually, I was going to do a station ID and I got carried away. And I'm probably going to end up using this now. So I need to pause for 10 seconds so I can have a space to find where the bumper goes. Okay. 4 Arrows, you wanted to say something?
Well, I wanted to give an example of what Darcia was saying about the emotion versus the reason and the understanding of sentience in non-humans. Not long ago, I gave a presentation on soil depletion, and I brought up 3 quotes of people I respect very much from the dominant culture. I think it was Franklin Roosevelt, Mahatma Gandhi, and Wendell Berry, right? 3 guys that I really like. And I found quotes about the importance of soil. And I think one of them, I don't remember who did what, but one of them was a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. One was, I think Gandhi said, to forget how to dig the earth and tend the soil is to forget ourselves. And I think Wendell Berry said, without proper care of the soil, we had no life. And I showed that to everybody, and I said, so that's the best we can get out of the Western worldview. I said, now consider a mentioning of soil from an indigenous worldview perspective. And I quoted Chief Seattle, and I'm going to read his. I got his down here. Every part of this soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Even the rocks thrill with the memories of stirring events connected with the lives of my people. And the very dust upon which we stand responds lovingly to our footsteps. And so comparing Chief Seattle's words about soil to these 3 brilliant and highly esteemed and highly environmentally sensitive people, the worldview is even apparent in the ways that Darcia explained, just in those words. And it was great when you think about, what those differences are, the animation and the sentience and the emotions that were involved with dust and soil feeling in these ways.
It makes me think of James Cameron's movie Avatar. At one point, the best-selling, most successful movie ever made, because he basically gives a similar message in that movie, where there's basically a line, the soil is alive.
That's right.
And everything is connected to everything else. Those are lines from the movie, and I really believe that one of the ways that we get this message out there is we've got to get storytellers. We've got to get people who write movies to tell this story, to communicate these ideas, and to show that the heroes are the people who embrace these ideas, that the victors, the ones who are successful. I don't like to use the word victors because it suggests dominance, and dominance is not an idea that is indigenous, really. But I think that we need to get those stories out there. So, and I've given talks at the Story Expo, which is a place where people who want to learn to tell movie stories go. And I talk about bottom-up ways of thinking about story. And I think that's where we need to be doing this. Somehow you got to get your book to James Cameron.
Well, here's a book I like to get to James Cameron that I wrote. That's my only fiction book. It's called Last Song of the Whales, and it's about a whale teaching about the plastic problem in the ocean. And the Cousteau Society endorsed it, and I got a professional whale expert to make sure that my fiction wasn't too far out. But I think any kinds of stories that relate to non-human intelligence and non-human educators of us is crucial, because that's really sort of one of the main worldview essences that we've missed, is being able to go out to a tree like we do at the Sundance and spend 2 hours contemplating and asking permission to cut it down, and going to its relatives and giving thanks before we carry it down into the arbor. People look at this and say, that's going a little bit too far. What am I going to learn from an ant or a tree or a rock? And until we can refer to natural resources as our relatives and really mean it, I don't think that we're going to get out of the economic externalities that are destroying our world.
Wow, until we can refer to natural resources as our relatives. I love that. So you have a chapter in the book by somebody who wrote about our relationship to trees. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That was White Standing Buffalo. In fact, I'm going to his Sundance next week. Bruce Lipton and White Standing Buffalo and I have done something that's very controversial still in Indian country, and that is, we are, like in my Sundance with Rick Two Dogs on Pine Ridge, Rick doesn't allow non-Indians to Sundance for the obvious reasons, for fear of misinterpretation, etc. But White Standing Buffalo and myself and Bruce Lipton decided that there's not enough of our indigenous people who still remember the old ways to be able to make the changes that we need for survival. So he, as a Cree Sundance leader, invites 40 people from the world to come. And, we don't charge money, but we invite them to come and participate in the building of the arbor, being at the Sundance inside the arena for the whole time. And it's been life-changing for people. So White Standing Buffalo, I came to Darcia and I said, look, I know this is a scholarly endeavor, our conference at the University of Notre Dame, but this is a guy that doesn't have a doctorate, he doesn't have a college degree, but his wisdom is so important, and so he was one of our speakers, and I would say that in many ways he saved the day, because when we got to some remember the controversy, Darcia, about when some of our scholars said, I think we're giving too much information to our non-Indian audience, and I handed it over to White Standing Buffalo to respond, and his response kind of got everybody back on the same page. Remember that?
What did he say?
Well, in essence, he said that no one owns this, that we're all indigenous to this planet. And if we have respect for the First Nations local traditions and their ceremonies and their understanding, that we can't decide who is going to be allowed to learn it and then participate in it and then share it. And, you know, he said it much better than I could have said it.
I know, because I know it's been an issue among Native Americans about appropriation of their culture.
As it should be. I mean, in Sedona, you know, someone killed 4 people in Inipi ceremonies, making, you know, money. And I mean, so this is, you know, it's certainly a misappropriation.
That's a sweat. You said Ipi. What kind of? You're talking about a sweat lodge ceremony, right?
Right.
What
yeah.
did you call it? An Ipi?
Yeah, it's called an Inipi ceremony.
Okay.
To living again. Yeah, so I mean, and he was sued. We used an old 1868 treaty that the government said if a bad man comes and does anything to harm your traditional ways, and we used that as part of the lawsuit for a charge of manslaughter for this guy who had made about $18 million. But I'm not dismissing the risks. Like I said earlier, you know, there are risks. I mean, bringing indigeneity into education is risky because education is what's caused much of our problems. You know, there's a lot of scholars from you know, UCLA and other that have said there's nothing meaningful of use in the indigenous past, and you know, I've quoted them in Unlearning the Language of Conquest. So, you know, education has been the enemy of.
So, Darcia, you're smiling as the university professor. What's your response to that?
Yeah, again, it's the dominance of reason and detached, what I call detached imagination that's taken over our education system, and that test scores somehow having a Jeopardy-like mind is what a smart person is like, that high IQ. And it's just, you know, that's what's destroyed the planet, all these bureaucrats with that kind of intelligence. So there's a lot missing, and we're still going in the wrong direction. It's just been terrible in the States. Forced kindergartens, though, around the world for children to be immersed in nature as a way to grow.
Wait, you said forest kindergartens?
Kindergartens, yeah. So there are places.
Kindergartens.
Yeah, there are places where they're trying to turn this around, but it's still very dominant because the people in charge of our societies have been trained this way, and that's what they think is the best. They impose what they succeeded at on everyone else. And so there's a lot of disruption now in our society in the U.S. Because people are very unsatisfied. They know things are going wrong and they want something done. And so they elected Trump in order to mess things up when he's doing a good job, you know, to just try to reorganize ourselves. And so this is a very dangerous moment, a opportunity moment, where we can, you know, waken ourselves up and realize we're connected. We're all in this together. There's no us against them. That's an illusion, you know, and that's what our indigenous worldview understands, that we're all in this together, that we all have an effect on everyone else, and that we have a responsibility to be caring and responsible.
Now, you mentioned before we started that you were invited to meet with the Pope. Why? What did you say, and why was he interested in what you had to say?
Well, it was because my book, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality, Evolution, Culture, and Wisdom, won the Expanded Reason Award, the inaugural award in 2017. And part of that, the money that you receive for that prize was from a Vatican foundation. So winners, I was the winner for research, the only authored book person. And we got to go to the Vatican, and there was a conference there, and all supported. And then we had an audience with the Pope. Essentially, you just get to shake his hand, you know, and make a comment and photographs and all that kind of thing. So it's just an honorific thing.
But the Pope has written and spoken about this concept. And I can't remember the exact word that he uses. Do you know the word?
Well, his book is called Laudato Si, and that he does talk about the importance of honoring indigenous ways and returning to that kind of wisdom within his book. And
it's not just indigenous ways, though. I mean, he talks about how we need to pay attention to how everybody is connected together. Here, let me see. I got it in my book here. 92. I want to try to give the quote that he has here. What he gave a TED talk, and the title of it is "Why the Only Future Worth Building Includes Everyone." And basically what he talked about is how we have to think about everybody, and that's this consciousness that I think is that the worldview that you're describing.
Well, in the religion, Christian traditional wisdom, the focus on everybody is usually only humans, except for Saint Francis and probably this Pope, right? So when you say everyone, it doesn't necessarily mean all my relations, the trees, the rivers, the animals, the soil, whereas it does in the indigenous or primal wisdom view. So I think we have to be careful there.
Yeah, and maybe try to change those things.
Well, I think it's really important for the Vatican to consider, and they are actually, maybe Darcia knows more about this, but we asked them to rescind the doctrine of discovery, and Pope Francis and others, indicated that they would actually reconsider this 500-year-old policy. But I haven't heard.
What is the doctrine of discovery?
Well, the doctrine of discovery were the papal bulls that allowed for Columbus and Cortez and others to take land and destroy communities. If anyone was not a follower of the Catholic religion, then they were considered to be below humans. And so the doctrine of discovery is why the United States, New Zealand, and Australia and Canada did not sign the Proclamation of Indigenous Rights until very late in the game, after they passed legislation essentially making their signature null and void or unimportant. Because like Vine Deloria wrote in one of my books, a chapter called Conquest Masquerading as Law, in which he shows that the doctrine of discovery that came from the Pope's doctrine is still wound tightly into all kinds of court precedents, and that if we went along with the Indigenous Rights document that 197 countries signed, then we would, almost every court case would be challenged, right? But we just wanted symbolically for the Catholic Church, the Vatican, to say, we rescind the doctrine of discovery.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That's from 1493. And then there are all sorts of other things that have put us in this pickle too, and that's the treatise on the law of corporations that was giving them the rights to take property from,
and the right of corporations to be persons, the corporate personhood.
Right.
In your book, you talk about how our Western culture only treats humans as persons, but actually it also treats corporations as persons.
Yeah.
Whereas the indigenous view is a tree is a person and every animal is a person that deserves respect.
Right. So what happened?
I took some notes I want to make sure I include here. You talk about how Western expansionism and global control have literally impaired people's capacities to perceive alternatives to our current pathway. And I guess this gets into the education thing. People, they have, and history really, they have such a narrow view of the way things have been and the way things are that they don't even see these other possibilities.
Part of it is the child development also. So you shut off the normal development of the brain in early life when you distress babies. You leave them alone, you leave them to cry. Very weird for a social mammal, but also because we are born 18 months early. We're like fetuses of other animals until 18 months of age. And so during that time period, you need a lot of supportive care, keeping babies in optimal arousal conditions so that their brain actually grows properly, millions of synapses a second. And so when you distress a baby, you start to misgrow the brain, and they necessarily become more self-centered. They can't be receptive and open-hearted or open-minded as a result. and then you lose this receptive intelligence to the awareness of life all around you, and just stick to your own, script to stay alive, to survive. And that's how you build a person now in the Western world.
Or build, when I talk about the potential of our bottom-up genes, and the idea of epigenetics, you got me onto epigenetics, really. Epigenetics is the idea that, we have genes, but they don't always express themselves. I give the example of if you take a redwood tree seed and put it in a cup of dry sand, nothing happens. Add water, you get a stunted little plant. Put it in a deep forest and you get a 300-foot tall tree. Same gene, different epigenetics. And what you're just describing is how this stunted planting, this dry sand way that we raise our children today, produces stunted individuals who don't have that, you call it heart-mind capacity.
That's right.
And, it made me, when you mentioned it, it made me think of a couple things. There have been some autopsies in Japan where for a long time people were encouraged to stunt and blunt their emotional expression. And what they found with those autopsies was that about 5% of the people, the corpses found, they had smile muscle atrophy. That's tragic that a culture does that. And if you think about it, that is what Western civilization has done to us.
That's right.
That is the challenge. Okay,
Yeah.
you're taking over our screen here and decolonizing and indigenizing education. Yes.
Actually, I didn't know you were going to be able to see that. No, those are just some quotes from some very famous people supporting the need for us, the absolute need for us to do what we're talking about. So I just thought I would send those to you. But
now, let me read a couple of them so that the radio listeners can hear them. We ignore indigenous peoples at our peril. Asham Rose Mujiro, Deputy Secretary General, United Nations. Noam Chomsky says the grim prognosis for life on this planet is the consequence of centuries of forgetting what traditional societies knew and the surviving ones still recognize. You mentioned Greg Kidjetti is one of your contributors to the book. Indigenous Wisdom provides the impetus for the urgency of a return to a true pathway for our future survival. Bill McKibben says, educators should be paying attention to this way of looking at things because I've learned more from my indigenous network than from anywhere else. And you've got a whole long list of these that are great. Yeah. Thank you. So, we got to do something about this. Another thing I'll just throw in, I learned from Frans de Waal, a Nobel Prize winning primatologist, is that empathy, that again, it's the heart-mind connection. It's something that evolved 200 million years ago when mammals first appeared on the planet. Empathy is tied in with lactation and with feeding infants. And we have rejected it. Our culture rejects empathy. That's what you're talking about, Darcia, when you talk about this reason way of thinking. The idea of compassion has to be a part of who we are. Anybody who advocates for eliminating compassion is crazy.
Well, it starts in babyhood again. If you have parents who did not receive empathy, empathic care as babies, they don't know how to take care of a baby. They think a baby's just sort of should be treated like a plant. Feed it, water it, keep it dry, whatever it is. And that's it. That's all they need. But we're social mammals. We need connection and bonding. Our brains grow from that. We're biosocially constructed. How our social experience shapes our biology, and then that is how we express our sociality and morality. And so, but adults are forgotten because they have themselves avoidant attachment, and they need a lot of healing in order to be able to respond.
But going back to the worldview, which is the water in which we swim that creates these kinds of ways we take care of children, is the phenomenon of dual complementarity. In all indigenous worldviews and indigenous cultures, the idea of from our origin stories, of complementarity creates empathy. Because, like, for example, in the Navajo story where the two come to the father, we have twin hero stories like all over the world. But in the twin hero stories, the solar twin, which is the counterpart to the lunar twin, monster slayer versus child born of the water, they come to the monster with the long arms. And monster slayer says, oh, I can shoot him, brother, no problem. But child born of the water says, put it away. I think it's not going to work. So they collaborate. And they say, well, what should we do? And they say, we should sing to him. But if we look at the twin hero story of Western culture, Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Hercules and Iphicles, the list goes on. The solar twin dominates or murders the lunar twin. So this idea of looking for complementarity and opposites is why diversity was so accepted. You know, the early conquerors that came into indigenous cultures, the first thing they wrote was, these people are so generous and open to us. You know,
well, you talk about extensively in your book the idea of the gift economy, the matriarchal gift economy. Talk a little. Why don't you talk a little bit about that too? Because we don't have that much time left.
Well, nature runs on a gift economy. You eat something, and then your waste feeds some other animal. And we just have, it's a cycle. And what's happened with capitalism, it's stopped all this. And people are learning to hoard and not share. But our natural inclination, when it's supported, is to share and to be part of a, gift giving back and forth and back and forth. Mothers are the first gift givers, and they gift without return at first with breastfeeding, although it does help the mother's health and all that. It's just part of the natural system, and somehow we've forgotten that. We've moved away from it.
Okay, so I just want to throw in a couple words that I picked up from the book. Western beliefs of individualism, human superiority, and separation from nature appear odd, rare, and even aberrant when considered from the perspective of the history of human cultures. Most societies in the history of the world would consider individual self-interest, assumed to be normal human behavior in most of the West, to be profoundly destructive and even a sign of insanity.
That's right. Yes. So that's self-interest, that to think that that's normal, to be only interested in yourself and to be self-centered. That's a very strange, insane way to be in most cultures. And
yet we celebrate individualism here. You know, you've got the Ayn Rand message in her books, where the individual has all the rights, and what you say is, in many cultures it would be considered insane.
That's right. We've built a sociopathic society, according to Charles Derber and Karl Polanyi and others, who point out that to get ahead now in the United States, you have to be a sociopath. You have to shut down your sense of responsibility, your relationships, sense of consequences to others, and just go for that money, right? And go for power and money. So we've created these people, and we support them, and it's all upside down.
And so you say that the indigenous worldview can provide a portal to global flourishing through the gift economy. How do we make a transition to a gift economy from capitalism?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I'm not that's not my area of expertise, but I think we start in the local community. We build locally, and we work locally, and we sustain locally. We concern ourselves with our local landscape. It tells us what it needs, just like a baby tells parents what they need. Our landscape, if we listen and pay attention, will tell us what's needed for that particular place to thrive, and then we will thrive too.
It's a tough battle. Like it with so many places like Walmart and fast food outlets, it's hard to even picture most people even thinking in those terms. So do you have any ideas for some steps that those of us who believe in what you're saying can do to bring others along?
Well, I think to change your own worldview first. Go ahead, Four Arrows.
No, I was just going to say, I believe if you really get this concept of generosity, of individuality in behalf of the greater good, I mean, a lot of times there's a confusion between the collectivist and individualist societies. You don't know more autonomous, independent people as indigenous people because they didn't have the hierarchy. They had independence, but their individuality was all about the greater good as opposed just to it being about the individual. Once that idea of generosity occurs, and that requires courage, because the greatest expression of courage is generosity. So when you're taught as a little one to give away your most precious value, you've entered into a gift economy already because of courage followed by generosity. And so we don't really need to come up with a plan of action to change the economic system. We just need to internalize the courage, the fearlessness that leads to generosity. And from generosity and local place-based efforts, this kind of thing emerges naturally in some form or the other.
What I write about in terms of healing practices is that we have to start with ourselves, learn to calm down, because most of us are highly anxious or highly reactive. And so we have to learn ways of self-calming, ways to get ourselves centered and balanced. Then also to develop a sense of connection and joy and love to be with others. That's another thing we neglect in our children now. They got screens instead of people in front of them. So to build the neurobiology of connection. And then we have to expand, maybe after that for kids, the expanded imagination. It's probably simultaneous, right? To realize we're connected always. Pay attention now. What do you hear? What do you sense? And what is your unique take on things? Everyone's an individual. Every snowflake is unique. So is every human being. And so in the indigenous societies, they honor that uniqueness of that child. They see what's special about that child. They honor, don't interfere with the development of the spirit of that child. That's what we have to return to in our education.
And another dimension that we haven't really discussed in the difference between Western and indigenous values is the idea of control. So I like the story you tell in the book of the clam harvesters. Talk about that.
Well, there was, and this is a common problem. The scientists trained in Western science that just look at little pieces of data, and then they think that they know how to act on a landscape or an ecosystem. Whereas those who live with that ecosystem and have generations of knowledge about how to help everything thrive in that ecosystem know more. Of course, it's the indigenous tribal folks who live in that area who know. And so in this one case, the Western scientists come in and say, oh, we're going to keep the clam population from crashing, so we're going to do this. And the native people who have kept the clam population thriving for generations said, no, that's not going to work. Oh, but you have to do it. And so they're forced into actually making things collapse. So their practice of moving clam groups around was decided to be wrong, and then the whole thing collapses. And so that happens over and over in the clash between civilizations here.
And so the message I get is our science tends to be top down, rigid and narrow focused in its thinking, non-systemic in the way it looks at things. And frankly, modern science has evolved to become based on systems thinking and nonlinear approaches, because it's the only thing that works to understand complex ecosystems and quantum physics and what have you. But our cultural mentality is still stuck on the Newtonian Cartesian way of thinking, this top-down, mechanistic, atomistic way of thinking. And that's what happened with these clam beds. The scientists said, well, the clams are in trouble, so you can't do anything with them at all. Leave them alone. And that didn't work, because the indigenous people had an understanding of their ecology. And when they were stopped from doing what they did, the clams got worse, not better.
There's also a missing link in that top-down control hierarchical process that we very rarely talk about. And in fact, the hegemons don't want us to talk about it. And I refer to it as trance-based learning. indigenous cultures understood, and I actually learned this from wild horses, but indigenous cultures understood that the human mind is very susceptible to authoritarian hypnosis, if you will. And as a result, they did ceremony. And ceremony is just a hypnotic phenomenon, if I put it into neuroscience words, where you go in with intentionality and then you go into an alternative state of awareness. You imagine possibilities of being more generous or being a better hunter or whatever. And we did these regularly, and understanding that it was required because we're very susceptible to authoritarian kinds of mandates, and because words are powerful.
And yet there are ceremonies among the indigenous people too. What's the difference?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that the ceremonies were the use of trance intentionally in order to make behaviors automatic, as opposed to giving it away to authoritarians.
Okay. All right. So,
yeah,
you're saying automatic in a healthy way.
In a healthy way, because what we know from sports psychology is willful determination and the law of reversed effect occur. You know, there's no athlete that completes a gold medal with just willful determination. They have to do this visualization and alternative consciousness thing that we call hypnosis, that I used to teach it at UC Berkeley.
And I ran a conference on optimal functioning and peak performance, and absolutely the way that athletes become ultimate athletes and peak performers is by rehearsal, mental rehearsal. But
if we've lost that skill, if we've lost that understanding, we give that over to the salesman, to the media, to the pope, the preacher, the peddler. We give that over to authoritarian figures. So that's one reason indigenous cultures did not have authoritarianism. They avoided hierarchy because of this phenomenon.
Now, so basically, because I think a ceremony is being somewhat authoritarian. So you're saying that it counteracted authoritarianism? Because to me, authoritarianism is one of the biggest problems of Western culture. And, a handful of people are the authoritarians, and I say this all the time, a handful of people are the authoritarians who tell people what to do, and 99.9% of the other authoritarians are the people who say, please tell me what to do.
Well, there's neurobiological reasons for that, and early life and childhood leads to authoritarianism when you are harsh with children. But Fourier was just talking about trance activities that the whole community participates in. You have the drumming that gets you into that trance state, for example, and it's a joint healing practice or grief, letting go of grief that happens, just ceremony. Nobody's in charge, really. It's not the kind of thing you think of a church service or something. This is different. This is the whole group dancing and chanting or whatever it is, depending on the culture.
Yeah, the opposite of a cult.
It makes me think of two things. One, the Sonoy were a group that has been written about a bit. I learned about them from Robert Wolfe, Original Wisdom, and it was a real privilege to get to know him. He wrote a lot for opednews.com over the years. But what they did was they shared their dreams every morning, and they made their decisions based on their dreams. The other thing is that one model of story creation is that you're trying to create a trance for the reader. If you do your job and tell a great story, you're putting the reader into a trance. And so I wonder, again, story fits into this. I really think that we've got to create stories. Now, you talked about the twin hero stories, which I never heard of, and I love the hero's journey model of Joseph Campbell, so I'm going to pick your brain on that. But one of the things I did explore with Chris Vogler, who wrote the book, The Writer's Journey, on about how to integrate the hero's journey into movies, is the idea that we need a collective hero. We need to have stories that are collective, and I think a nice intermediate way is going with the twin heroes. I love that because that gives the kind of the yin and the yang angle, right?
Yep.
We're just about out of time. We got 2 minutes left, and there's so much more we can do with this. But So how do we want to wrap this up? Any final words?
Well, I would recommend reading a few books that people can read to try to expand their imaginations. Books by Calvin, Luther, Martin, The Way of Being Human, for example, or In the Spirit. And then Rupert Ross has worked with Canadian First Nations peoples, and he talks about in his several books Indigenous Wisdom and how they use these circles of healing that are very egalitarian, and talks about how that disturbed or made the European invaders mad when they took so long to make decisions. But that's using your whole brain to make a decision, or going around the circle till there's consensus, which is a great way to make decisions if they're significant, right? So anyway, Rupert Ross, those two come to mind immediately.
Okay, 4 Arrows.
I would recommend the idea of the cat and the fawn. It's a simple mnemonic for people to remember, that the cat would represent this trance-based learning, but fawn is fear, authority, words, and nature. And if they use worldview reflection whenever they have a problem and say, okay, in what way am I interpreting fear? Am I interpreting authority? Am I interpreting words? And am I interpreting nature? And if they're doing it from a Western way, that's the source of their problem. If they change it to an indigenous perspective, where fear is a catalyst for practicing a virtue, authority only is reflection on lived experience. It doesn't come from external. Words are sacred. They can't be deceptive. And nature is a teacher. It changes everything.
All right. And we've got a wrap. You've been listening to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guests have been Darcia Narvaez and 4 Arrows, and we've been talking about the book, Indigenous Sustainable Wisdom, First Nation Know-How for Global Flourishing. Thanks so much for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks.